Fire These Times. My name is Aydın Yıldız. I'm coming in with a couple announcements today before we get started with our show. As some of you may know, I am a founding member of From the Periphery Media Collective and a co-producer for our podcasts, including this one. I typically stay behind the screens here, helping with all the fun administrative and collective infrastructure work we've been building out, and it's through that work that I see our audience is growing. Welcome, newcomers. We're so glad you found us. We at From the Periphery are proud to be an independent, autonomously organized group of people who are dedicated to uplifting, on-the-ground, grassroots storytelling and analysis. As you may know, there are 10 of us in this collective, most of whom are volunteering our time. Our collective includes the podcasts The Fire These Times, Obscuristan, Politically Depressed, the online zine and archive Antidote Zine, for which I'm also an editor, and a couple other podcasts soon to come. One of our newest upcoming productions will be a podcast hosted by Leila Al-Shami and Elia Ayoub, devoted entirely to storytelling and reflection on the Syrian revolution, war, the country's history, and its present day. The work we do is tough, and it takes a lot of background work to produce. We're also a collective of anti-capitalists who are committed to making these stories accessible to as many people as possible. So we don't run ads, we don't work with big-moneyed institutions, and we don't spend a lot of time playing games with the algorithms because we're busy doing the work. We rely on you all, dear listeners, to help support our work. Plus, when you join our community on Patreon, you get access to monthly hangouts, exclusive content, early access to new episodes, merch, and more. You can join us for as little as $5 a month, and we always welcome more. Thanks for considering it, and thanks to all of you who already support us. We couldn't do it without you. We'll have links in our show notes for where you can follow us and how you can subscribe. That's it from me. I hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dana Al-Kurd. I'm a Palestinian researcher and writer and professor as my day job, and I'm very happy to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anna. I'm a co-host of Obscuristan and a lawyer and Armenian here in the United States.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Elia. Been doing this for a few years now. I'm currently a postdoc researcher and I write stuff. Naomi?
I'm Naomi. I am based in British Columbia, Canada. Unceded Shishut territory most of the time, and I also write stuff, and I also teach stuff.
Yeah, so we wanted to have this conversation. Thank you a lot for coming on. It's gonna kind of be or revolve around Doppelganger because that's kind of been my recent one of my recent favorite books, and probably to get into it throughout this conversation. But it's gonna also be more partly about the broader topics of conspiracy thinking. What is it like to challenge someone who is quote unquote on the other side? What are the implications of some of the stuff you get into to the kind of organizing spaces and like your long history of writing about activism and challenges and all of that. And we have like 3 different, let's call them perspectives, although aligned, but like different positionalities rather. And we, the hope is that basically this enriches the wider conversation. I'll start by saying that like the reason why I wanted to do an episode on Doppelganger as like almost like a standalone initially, is that I resonated a lot with some of the themes that you get into in the book. And the broader, the to keep it even general, the way to think about this mirror world, as you call it, is something that's very familiar to, I think, the 3 of us, although we come from different positionalities and different experiences. Whether it be my experience with Syria, for example, Lebanon, Dana, obviously, Palestine, and Anna with Armenia and Artsakh, we saw similar themes or like commonalities that most folks, I think, would have missed. And personally, the framework of starting to think about it as like the mirror world, or like thinking of conspiracy thinking, of like understanding them as almost like as narrative structures, helped helped a lot. Because before that, I would just be lost a lot of the time. It's like, why is someone believing this, given that, well, it's not real, or clearly this is absurd or whatever. And it took me a while to realize what you yourself point out in the book, that the other side, quote unquote, sees us in similar enough terms. And that can be very unsettling. If we can get it, for those who haven't read Doppelganger, obviously we're going to ask everyone to do so, but for those who haven't, can you give us a bit of an overview of like, what is it about? And after you do, I'm going to share kind of an anecdote because it is a bit funny. And I've never had any reason to share that specific anecdote, and now I have, so I'll do that.
That's very intriguing. The thing about Doppelganger is it unlike pretty much every other book I've written, it's hard to summarize. I had such an easy kind of capsule. What is the shock doctrine? What is this changes everything? And I think it's important for me to say just off the top that like Doppelganger is, I consider, a work of creative nonfiction, unlike the other books I've written, which, cared about the writing. I always care about writing, but it's more experimental in its form, which just makes it harder to say what Doppelganger is about. I'm still trying to figure it out. And it's one of the things that makes it fun to talk about, because I think more than anything I've ever written, like Doppelganger actually inspires other writers and thinkers to just play, like I take it in places I never could have imagined. With the shock doctrine, people would be like, you forgot a chapter about Turkey, or, applying its framework, but in a way that was very recognizable to me, where people have taken Doppelganger is like so cool to me. Like I've learned so much from these conversations, which is why I was really looking forward to this one, because I see so many connections and affinities between what you've been doing with this podcast and your various projects, and some of what I was trying to get at with Doppelganger, which the short form of it is like it's an attempt to map the wildness of now, including the way everything has seemed to turn upside down, and we don't know who and what we can trust, including ourselves. And I use the literary tool of the fact that I have a doppelganger, i.e. somebody who many, many people have confused with me over these many years. So, the phrase doppelganger comes from the German. It translates as a double walker. And in mythology, it's often like the experience of somebody, walking down the street and seeing themselves. My experience of having a doppelganger isn't exactly that. It's other people telling me that I have done things I haven't done, screaming at me about it, thanking me for it, and just like a confusion on a mass scale in the way that sort of only the internet can produce. And I don't think that that's particularly unique. There's lots of people who I confuse with other people online. I don't think our brains are wired to encounter as many names and faces, especially in as small forms as we do on social media. So we tend to like put people in different baskets. And I got put in the same basket as a writer named Naomi Wolf, who also writes nonfiction books. But it struck me as a helpful way to get at. So because not only is she a kind of a doppelganger of me, but she's a doppelganger of herself. She's one of these people who we all know and who you talk about, on the show, like people who used to be one way and just kind of seemed to change, fell down the rabbit hole, started believing these wild things, right? One of these people where we're like, whatever happened to that person, So she's kind of a doppelganger of who she used to be, who was a sort of a mainstream liberal feminist. And now she's hanging out with Steve Bannon and cheering on Donald Trump and the January 6th insurrection, showing off her gun, talking about the war on the border. I mean, she's gone full and has conspiracy theories about everything from ISIS beheadings to cloud formation. Like there's nothing that she doesn't have a conspiracy about. Now and so basically I used my own identity confusion to kind of fall down the rabbit hole with her and try to understand this world that she now inhabits. We used to be in a similar political space. Now we're not, but that's not just true of her and me. That's true of lots of people. And so this is why the book is very, very hard to describe. It ends in Gaza. I wrote it, it came out a month before October 7th. So it looks at ultimately it's a book about fascism, I guess is what I could say. And many literary works have used the figure of the double to get at the uncanniness of fascism, like of the way a whole society can flip into its sort of evil twin, and that sort of sense of menace and that sense of like, has it happened already? Are we there yet? Can I trust my neighbor? Have they joined the mob? I think we all either have experienced that ourselves or know people who've had that like very direct experience. So I feel like we're in a moment like that. And so I use this very kind of mundane thing of just being mass confused with someone else to basically write a book about fascism, but through various back doors, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So the anecdote, which I will now share, is that I kind of knew. So I was Facebook friends with the author Naomi years ago, back a century ago, when it was very easy to just add people on Facebook, and when people were still using Facebook. And I was writing for Global Voices at the time, and it was 2014, so exactly 10 years ago, during the last war on Gaza, which of course wasn't as bad as the current one. It wasn't technically a genocide, but it was quite bad at the time. And I had written an article, I remember which one, it was just an Israeli ex-IDF guy who was, he turned into a whistleblower, and he was kind of exposing all of these things. And so she shared that article on Facebook, and she did the thing that I later recognized. At the time, I didn't think about it too much, to be honest, which was like what we would call baking, which is kind of like finding different links that aren't there, connecting dots that aren't actually there, and all of that. And she was doing this in this kind of participatory thing. She was asking her followers on Facebook to chime in and all of that, which I recognized later on as like a thing that folks in the conspiracy world do a lot. At the time, I hadn't really encountered it. This was literally 10 years ago now. But that's kind of my funny way into this, that when I was reading this doppelganger, I did not know about it. I didn't know that there was lots of people who were confusing you with her and whatnot. But then you go through the details, and there was this funny, I think, like husbands are the same first name, and like just other commonalities which are funny and I'm sure very uncanny and uncomfortable at the same time. And then I realized at some point, like, oh, this is the person that I actually interacted with like 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, things have just gotten weirder, basically.
It's interesting because I do have a little section of the book when the subhead is When She Was Right. And it's about that. It's about that 2014 moment where she had a awakening as somebody who grew up as a liberal Zionist. And I think she'd spent time living in Israel, and she seemed to have had a fairly conventional Jewish upbringing, and all of her sort of illusions fell away at once. And she was describing it as a genocide. She got all kinds of blowback. And this is, I have a part of the book where we talk about, the thing that bothers me most about being confused with her is that she's a liberal, and she was a liberal and I'm a leftist. And I do think that, yes, she had a critique of patriarchy in her first book, The Beauty Myth, but it was always sort of a lean-in critique, right? It was always, okay, these beauty standards are unfair to women because it's keeping us from advancing, in the corporate workplace or in politics because we have all of this extra beauty labor or whatever. That's fine. It's just not my politics, So it was always annoying to me. But I do think that it's important in sort of understanding there is a particular type of person who gets radicalized over Palestine, and they're often liberals because it's so shocking to them. They believed, they believed these liberal self-flattering myths, and then and Zionism and Israeli war crimes unmask it so completely that it creates this complete shock. And then you say, well, this is wrong. And then you get completely kicked out of your community. So she had that experience. I mean, she was sort of, in a way that, I grew up in a actual left family, and, third generation red diaper baby. So like, I didn't get kicked out of my family. I grew up with, I didn't lose as much as she lost, right? I didn't have the illusions she had. But I know other people like that, and they are liberals. They are not leftists. This is what bothers me about horseshoe theory, because I actually, if you look at her or RFK Jr. or Glenn Greenwald, these are these are kind of hardcore liberals who really believed in like the myth of America, and they're very patriotic and all that. And so I just think we should just define it properly, because there's actually not that many Marxists who are prone to become conspiracy, believers in fantastical conspiracies. I've seen it much more commonly. I'm not saying they never do, but I actually think like a firm hold on the workings of capitalism is your best defense against conspiracy thinking. It's not fail-safe, but if you have pretty much no analysis of capital, and then you suddenly realize that things are not as they seem, you're much more prone to believing these fantastical stories. It's interesting you called it baking, because now that needs to be distinguished from cooking.
That's true.
Good.
I actually wrote down horseshoe theory right before you said it, but it strikes me that most often the poles that are described as most similar are leftists and conspiracy theorists, and there's an idea, and you can understand why. And I think in your book you talk about like the funhouse mirror that we're all being filtered through, and why why these things are held up as very similar. But what I think the most interesting thing about your book was how much it resonated with me, that path actually does not go through leftism. It might touch on some things that leftism touch on, like it might kind of ding it
Like
a little bit on the way.
critique power in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and if you're critiquing power, you're going to end up critiquing some of the same stuff eventually. But that the path actually does not like travel through being a leftist into being in this funhouse mirror world. It's actually much more direct. And that I think is really valuable, just because in the same way that like Naomi Wolf is seen as a doppelganger of herself, I think probably some of us can relate to being seen as doppelgangers of ourselves if you move away from liberalism, but they could not be more different mechanisms. And I think it's worth drilling into that, because some of the reason that this funhouse mirror is so realistic is because there's an unwillingness to actually examine its component parts and see that like it looks like glass, it's behaving like glass in some ways, but actually like on a much more granular level, it is not in fact glass. But I think maybe we can go into this a little bit towards the end of the episode in much more depth.
But I just want to add one thing, Anna, which is just I mean, there are some people who I think are leftists, but I'm just saying this because I think you'd grapple with this a lot on the show, right? Around people whose guiding worldview I mean, they're definitely not liberals, but neither are they primarily anti-capitalists. It's mainly anti-imperialist, right? So it's definitely leftist, and they're not. These people are not. I mean, I wouldn't put them in the sort of Naomi Wolf camp. We can all imagine, and there's lots of people who. I mean, I feel like this is a lot of who you've been talking about around Syria, right? Where they're the animating force in their lives is anti-US imperialism. And I'm against US imperialism too, but I think that having that as your animating life force without a broader engagement with capitalism also gets you into the mirror world pretty fast.
It's a shallow anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it can be chauvinist.
Yeah, I think one of the things we argue on the show, but also that shows up, is that these struggles draw on each other, and the blind spots that result from not having a pulse on other issues can show up pretty quickly. So this, like, I mean, you're talking about imperialism and capital, but for me, I think I most often see it when it comes to imperialism and abolition. When those aren't in dialogue, I see like real issues coming up and how anti-imperialism is manifested. Because for me, anti-imperialism was also the thing that animated me away from liberalism. But it was in conjunction with abolition. And I think that played a huge, huge role in how I see the anti-imperial movement. But I do see it as a different camp, I think, than the sort of more direct pipeline that I think your doppelganger represents.
For sure, but I think one place where they come together is this question of whether or not you just want your turn in the system, or, where if we think about her critique of patriarchy, it was just like, she just wanted women to be able to be at the top within these same structures, right? So I think that, what Donna's referring to as shallow anti-imperialism, like, is a similar, some forms of it are just like, it's our turn now, right? Like, we don't want to change these fundamental power structures. We just want our turn, right? And that becomes a replication. It becomes a doppelganger, right? And this is, I think Zionism is a pretty powerful example of that. I mean, in its own way, not as anti-imperialist, but as a sort of an understanding of what it means to fight anti-Semitism is basically Jews get to do what white people have done around the world. And yeah, it's an our turn now, a sort of approach to justice.
And that's my biggest concern. I mean, we don't have to segue to Israel-Palestine quite so quickly, but that's my biggest concern with what people are understanding of this moment when it comes to the Palestinian. Like, are we deducing the right implications from what we've witnessed, especially in the last year, and have we learned what Palestine actually means?
I can have an interesting segue, because as you guys were talking, I thought of like who could be a doppelganger, not only necessarily for me personally, but like for a lot of people who were, for example, in Lebanon and Gaza while the Israelis are bombing, or in Syria now as well, for that matter. And that's the IDF's Arabic spokesperson. He's actually often referred to by his first name. I literally don't even remember the last name now, Avishai. And there's something about him that's very uncanny, because he speaks our language. And so the way I put it, that I was having this chat with a journalist, is that he can understand, or in theory, he can understand a mother mourning her dead child. He can literally understand what she is saying. Whereas like Netanyahu doesn't have to, and he can't, but he doesn't have to. And for most people in Lebanon, especially because unlike in Gaza, where they would bomb absolutely everything, although they did that in parts of Lebanon as well, they often would release those maps to let people know, basically, sometimes with like 20 minutes in advance and sometimes with 2 hours in advance or whatever, that, we're going to bomb here. And those maps became very, very kind of familiar in many ways, and they were always associated with him, because he would be the ones, at least on his account, releasing them on social media and whatnot. So people would literally be talking to one another and say, like, have you seen what Avishai said? Have you seen where they have pointed, the next place to be bombed or whatever? And there's something about him. I wrote a piece on my newsletters, like he's the face of death in Lebanon, because most people in Lebanon would literally see him more frequently than the face of Netanyahu, because he would be like literally every day, like a dozen different times. And there's something about him, that the fact that you almost like, for me personally, I've felt this a few times, like, you speak our language, surely right? Like I go through these moments, and because he's been doing this since 2006 or something. And yet every time I have this, I'm almost tempted to believe like, he's going to come around or whatever. It's not rational. These are just like thoughts that come through. He, says,
know our slogans, our slang.
You're able to talk to us, and he does on his YouTube channel. He has these debates with Palestinians, or he used to do them, not anymore, whatever. But whereas with Netanyahu, at no point do I have this. He's just someone I know. He wants to be in power, and he is very racist, and he wants to take land. Like, it's kind of more boring is not the term, because like, how can I describe a genocide as boring? But like, it's more predictable, I guess. Whereas with him, with Avishai, I always feel like he's almost there. You're almost there, but you never are. And that kind of feels very, very uncomfortable.
Well, see, that uncanniness, I mean, I kind of feel it with a lot of Arab Jewish communities in Israel. Just like there's so much, there are so many parallels in some ways. And we've come to very different conclusions about those parallels. So yeah,
That's a very good point, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ben Gvir is of like, I think, Iraqi Kurdish origins or something like that.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, don't get me started on Ben Gvir. And all of the ways in which kind of his anti-Arab sentiment, like how much of that is like Israeli, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
It's the chill of the familiar, right? I mean, when you can just say like, this is so other, that's it's horrible, but it's simple, right? And you're able to push it away. But I mean, this is where, when I see Wolf brandishing her gun and talking about the war on the border, and making these chilling alliances with people who she herself used to call the devil, it's a lot harder. I mean, it has that same chill, it has that same chill that I don't have when I watch Trump or whatever. I mean, it's like there's no part of me that understands him, that, if he feels like another species. But I mean, it's not just because people confuse me with her, but it's because she feels like there's a weird way I feel related to her,
Like
and
at some level, there's a similar starting
the kinship,
Yeah.
and that's what Freud wrote about doppelgangers. Otto Rank wrote about doppelgangers first, and from in a psychoanalytic framework. But they were having this debate. Otto Rank was his student, and then they fell out. But Freud was speculating that there's this draw to the doppelganger in the arts because they stand in for the lives we might have led. Like, we all have this sense that the lives that we have are, the result of partially our own choices and something that we can own, but also decisions that were totally not ours. Our parents deciding to emigrate, and leaving, and and it's why, when we see people who look like us in huge danger or committing crimes, it just lights up the kind of randomness of the lives that we have, right? And that uncanniness, I think, is fruitful, actually. Like, I think it's more useful for us to be able to identify with people who commit horrible crimes than it is for us to always be able to push it away and say that's them.
Yeah, you can't occupy this kind of like moral high ground.
And we're always reaching for it because it's too terrible.
It kind of reminds me of what James Baldwin says about how, like, that
I
cop could be you.
I was gonna say that, Dana.
Sorry, I was quicker.
Sorry, go for it.
No, I mean, just that it's uncomfortable, but it's actually, I mean, for any kind of future-minded politics, we need to be able to, in some ways, have that empathy. Not empathy for people's crimes, but have that empathy for some basic starting points, let's say.
I actually think that this is where abolition really like helps inform a good way to like stop yourself from becoming a terrible person, frankly, because abolition of prisons and of police really does force you to confront the worst parts of not like your country or your, whatever, the world you live in. It's not that. It forces you to confront the scariest parts of your community, the scariest things that you might actually see yourself experiencing. And that type of like exercise in empathy, I think also like gives you a pathway to it does form a pathway to imagining an alternative way of being and of living. And where I think sometimes it's missing in both anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist work is that if you can see yourself being an oppressor in a different context, that is really powerful for how you might structure your movement or your society in order to constrain that corruption of yourself too. And I think that that's something that like abolition and abolition spaces give a pathway toward, of how you create justice, accountability, and then like really keep in mind of what like horror you're trying to prevent, while also always kind of seeing yourself in sometimes in the worst ways. And honestly, it's an exercise that like is kind of scary, but I think like it's just really important. But it really does provide a structure for how you can structure your movements for liberation.
Yeah, so obviously the last year has been catastrophic for Palestine, the war in Gaza and the ongoing genocide, and the maybe added layer of catastrophe is the fact that there continues to be a lack of a pathway forward. And that's been coupled with an authoritarian resurgence here in the United States and in the global north more broadly. I can speak from the United States, the crackdown on academic freedom, on protest, on essentially people's demands for accountability in foreign policy, culminating in the election for Trump. All of that, that's the backdrop with which we've, experienced the last very exhausting year. But in some ways, the questions that led us to the moments of catastrophe remain the same as they do now in this new stage of catastrophe, which is essentially that, like, what future exists for Israel-Palestine? And can we envision a pathway forward that is beyond kind of a zero-sum view of the conflict, or a zero-sum view, especially now we're recording December 17th, 2024, in the shadow of genocide. So obviously I've been following your work and you're speaking about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these issues. So first, given where we are now and that Trump has been elected, we are going to see even more of a state crackdown in an unprecedented way, as well as a Trump foreign policy exemplified by the appointments of people like Lee Stefanik and Mike Huckabee. So I'm wondering, how should the pro-Palestine movement and pro-Palestine activists here in the United States, or maybe in the global north broadly, I know you're in Canada, but generally speaking, those pro-Palestine activists, how should we think about shifting to meet this current moment? I know it's a lot.
Yeah, no, it's a lot. But it's a great question. And I would just say we're talking, I don't know when this is going to air, but we are talking in this sort of interregnum. Like, we don't really know where we are right now, right? It's not a full pause. I mean, Trump is staffing up. He's throwing out all kinds of trial balloons. But the truth is, we don't know what February is going to look like. We really don't. But it's a very good time to think about what's going to guide us, right? Like, who we want to be in what is coming. And yeah, I'm not in the United States by choice. I moved back to Canada during the pandemic. Luckily, that was possible for me. But we're all impacted wherever we are in the world by what happens there. And we have our own far-right party in waiting that will probably be in power by the end of the year, by summer. I've really been struck by, I was talking to my 12-year-old this morning, he's obsessed with this bill, which is the shorthand of which is the nonprofit killer, right? Which is, they've been trying to get through Congress. They will get it through under Trump. But it uses Palestine as the wedge, really, to shut down the whole left nonprofit
Civil
sector.
society.
Civil
Right.
society, universities, all of it. And we've seen this before. I mean, we saw it after 9/11. But more than that, I think that what we're seeing very clearly in the lack of fight back, I mean, it's extraordinary. You would think that, given the level of threat, that there would be some kind of coordinated response from liberal nonprofits, universities, foundations, who are all in the crosshairs. None of them are even working together. They're all terrified, getting ready to capitulate, if not already doing so. And the capitulation in the face of Palestine from our universities, that we saw from our NGOs, just the willingness to shut up. Not everyone, we know who the exceptions are, but just huge swaths of liberal society, the arts, the museums, whatever. Like, I was involved in a lot of the pen fights, all of this was preparing the ground for the capitulation that that we are kind of already seeing. So nothing stays where it is. And maybe there's, I think that your question, Dana, around like what is next. I mean, some of it, I feel, as somebody who doesn't live in Israel, I'm not identified with Israel as a project. I feel like my project as a Jewish person is the exodus from Zionism, is sort of the viability of diasporism. my values and principles and ethics guide what I think the future of Israel and Palestine should be in the same way that it does pretty much anywhere else. Like I believe in equality, period. So like that the future has to be rooted in equality and justice and reparation, right? That's not special. Like that's just what I believe about everywhere. It's but I do think that we need to be looking here. When I say we, I mean we, the left, wherever we are, we need to build coalition. We need to build connection across our differences and silos. They need to be guided by legible principles, which once again, I think is what, is another way of saying what we've all been talking about and what you've been talking about in your critiques of multipolarity, right? Of like towards what end? What are the guiding principles? If we don't have guiding ethics and principles and worldview, then we're completely at sea and we're just choosing teams, right? So I am increasingly interested in what the relationship to Israel and Palestine on the right lights up about the millenarian worldview that is at the core of the project of the right now. And I think that we can see it in the Christian Zionists who Trump is appointing, but I also think we can see it in the tech executives that he's appointing and these fantasies about sort of literally abandoning Earth for Mars, or basically torching this planet by using so much energy to create a literal mirror world, which is what AI is, right? It's a fake world based on our world. A mirror of everything we've ever produced, except the catch is that it devours so much energy that it lights this world on fire. And so what is it about this desire for escape? What is so wrong with this world? Like, why must we place our hopes for the future in leaving this place, in leaving this world? And it brings me to the sort of the Jewish history around here-ness, right? That's part of the tradition that I feel like is the unearthing, that our friend Molly Crabapple is involved in writing her incredible book that will come out about the Jewish Labor Bund. But that's just one tradition of here-ness, of really of celebrating the sacredness of this place, of this realm. I don't think it's secular exactly, because I actually think part of it is about recognizing the sacred of creation, like of
life.
Of life, yeah. And that that animates the way I like the way I encounter the world. I also get attacked for it. I wrote a piece, as you all know, after October 7th that got me massively canceled online for a line that said "stand with the child over the gun." But I believe that those kinds of principles are like stand with the prisoner, not the guard, in the context of Syria. Like if we had more of those clear principles, that we were not afraid to, stand with the worker, not the authoritarian state repressing them. Like, I think we cannot be shy. I think it is radical. I don't think it's liberal. I don't think it's, I think if we really applied any of these principles, it would be revolutionary. Yeah, I think it's devouring the left, not because most people agree, but because the bullying has been successful. And so a lot are saving their disagreements for their private chats with friends. I can say that personally, that's basically what I've been doing this year. And I'm not going to do it anymore because I think it's a moral disaster. And I think it happened for, I would be curious to hear your perspective on this, Donna, because I think for a lot of the people I know, it was like, we did not think it would last this long. And it was, we are going to get a ceasefire. It's going to be, at first it was, we thought that this couldn't go on longer than a month, that 2 months, 3 months. And so I think we got into a habit of silence, right? Because it makes sense that in the middle of a genocide, that does not feel like the right time to air our disagreements. And certainly I can say from a Jewish perspective, it didn't feel like the time to argue with Palestinian comrades who, and I'm not saying that this was mainly coming from Palestinians. I don't think that it was. A lot of it was coming from some of the same folks we've been talking about from a sort of a campus perspective, who are not Palestinian, who are happy to speak on behalf of the global South or whatever. But silence becomes a habit, right? What's that line? Like sooner or later, the mask becomes the face. And I think, I teach university students, some of us do, and it puts you in touch with how, if people talk in a certain way for a year, and that's the dominant way, then that just becomes what the left is, right? If that's the loudest voices become the left. And if there isn't a clear alternative that is like, okay, these are the principles, these are the legible principles that guide us. This is what we believe in. And we are also the left. And, you could choose to join this tendency, then people will be like, okay, I guess this is how you oppose genocide. I guess these are the rules. So, I think the time for biting one's tongue is over. And it is still going to be hard, and it's still gonna hurt to argue in the middle of a genocide. But I would say that so the people that we're talking about don't have any qualms attacking, their own side in the middle of a genocide.
Absolutely.
So this is sort of unilateral disarmament. Enough.
Right. No, since, I'm an academic and very academically minded, I think about like studies of social movements and how social movements that are particularly successful have both radical and moderate flanks. So I kind of want to throw it back to you. Is like, do you feel like that division of labor is useful? Of course there are challenges to that, and what challenges do you see in that? But is that a lens that should frame our movements, that it's a division of labor?
I think there are contexts in which I do, I would, frame it more as sort of inside outside division of labor, right? The pushing from the outside and the negotiating on the inside. I think it's really important that there be accountability between people on the inside and the people on the outside. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the distinction between what is radical and what is moderate resonates with me. I'm not sure I'm willing. Like I said, I believe that that actually standing on the side of life, in the context of genocide and ecocide, and the normalization of mass death on pretty much every front, I don't believe that's moderate. I don't believe it's liberal. I believe it is radical, transformational, and the kinds of discussions. I like. There's a posture of radicalism that actually defends these institutions, defends massive states, with massive armies. I don't know. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see the definition of what is radical to the self-styled radicals.
Yeah, no, fair point. Fair point. Yeah. I've also been thinking, kind of applying some of the lessons that we've learned on the ground in Israel-Palestine to informing how we might function abroad. And to be clear, I think that we do need to function abroad, like the Palestinian diaspora community, the American Jewish community, or broadly more in the global North. Like we are in countries that are obviously directly responsible for these dynamics, and so we can't kind of distance ourselves because we are not directly impacted necessarily. But yeah, in Israel-Palestine, kind of the anti-apartheid and largely anti-Zionist Jewish activists talk about this concept of co-resistance, that it goes beyond solidarity. It's about resisting apartheid together. And so I'm quoting here from some of the organizers at Masaf that talk about, quote, the choice to resist together can be perceived as rubbing up against the principle of anti-normalization, which holds that relations with Israel and Israelis should not be conducted normally. And that, coexistence programs normalize the occupation, but our work has responded to this principle by offering a framework of co-resistance, which is predicated on a shared commitment to fighting for Palestinian liberation and an acknowledgement of differentials of powers. And then there are some, like the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, that talk about co-resistance as a form of joint activism, but it's a joint non-violent struggle against apartheid and genocide in Palestine and Israel. So my questions stem from trying to apply what's learned about co-resistance in that context to, kind of broadly ask, where do Jewish communities in the global north fit into this? Like, how do we create co-resistance when largely it seems that it's the not explicitly anti-Zionist Jewish side of things. So, the Jewish communities, like the anti-Zionist portion, is a small segment. But there's growing, but more broadly, I think there are people who identify as liberal Zionists who have mobilized in this moment as well. But like all of that kind of mobilizing around ceasefire and things like that, it's running in parallel too. It's not running in connection with necessarily Palestinian diaspora organizing. So where do we see co-resistance coming to play with these communities? What does co-resistance look like moving forward in the global north? Sorry, that's a very big question too.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, sometimes I think that it's like coming back to what I was saying before about like what if we are anti-Zionist as Jews, like what is our relationship? Like why is solving Israel-Palestine like we're trying to disentangle our identity from an ethno-state, right? To say like at the core of this is the fact that all of these Jewish institutions have systematically entangled Jewish identity, religion, summer camp, everything with this ethno-state. And so I think a lot of our work is disentangling it and saying there's another way to be Jewish. And here where we are, we've got work to do in keeping the bomb, like stopping the bombs from going, and organizing for change, whether it's finding ways to take on AIPAC and recognizing that they are a foreign agent that is interfering in the democracy, connecting that with a broader movement against donor power over politics, over our universities. I think is the more that we can de-exceptionalize this issue, like, because this isn't like, yes, this is money interfering in politics, but money interferes in politics. It's basically at the core of every crisis that we have. So the more that we can de-exceptionalize this and make it part of a broader, get money out of politics, stop donors from running our universities, I think the better off we are. And because we'll have a stronger movement, we'll be more protected from accusations of anti-Semitism, and we have to fight anti-Semitism here because the more it is allowed to rise, the stronger the case for Israel is. And then asserting these core principles around international law and equality that should govern whatever happens there, right? I'm just speaking as myself, as someone, I don't want to overplay my connection to that place, I think that it's been overplayed by others, I visited a few times. It's not where I live. And I resent the fact that my identity has been entangled with it. So I don't want to act like it's mine, I want to kind of reclaim my Judaism from it. And I want to fight for the kids. Like I want to fight for the next generation, because I think that we can build institutions and new traditions and culture that is, as Ariel Angel, who's the editor of Jewish Currents and is, a wonderful person and friend, says, like, if you're going to ask people to lose their, community, if taking on Zionism means losing all of these, communities that you grew up in, then you better have some other institutions to welcome them into, right? So I think that that's a lot of our work.
I do sometimes worry that the lessons learned from this is not that Palestine stands in as a struggle for liberation, as representing values against ethno-nationalism, against state power, against, you know, all of these mechanisms of destruction that have upended our lives and theirs. Instead, Palestine being understood as, you know, just another national, you know, identity project. Of course, there's the Palestinian national movement. You know, it's a Palestinian national movement. Like, I understand what the aspirations of the Palestinian people are, and historically speaking, but for us to actually face the full breadth of destruction that the Israeli model represents, we need to go beyond that. And I worry that actually hasn't been absorbed, or that, like, people, like you said, people within our movement, like, can use particular language and weaponize particular language and speak the language of leftism sometimes, or the language of these kinds of values and liberation, but really what they want is something else. What they want is their turn, right? And there was an interesting article and an interview with the author at Jewish Currents, Abdul Omar, that Ariel interviewed, about how the only thing right now that seems to exist for Palestinians is either absolute collaboration or armed resistance. So the fact that these lessons aren't being learned isn't an accident. It's the fact that middle, or the, not even middle, because like you said, I don't necessarily think it's the moderate segment, but any other alternative has been wiped out. And then we see, like, in the last poll for the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, that 48% of Palestinians choose armed struggle as the pathway forward, 50% in the West Bank and 36% in the Gaza Strip, so the average. So, like, again, it's not an accident that those are the options available to people, that these are the conclusions people are coming to, but it speaks to a lack of imagination. You know, that if the underlying premise is we want an end to mass violence and suffering, and that Palestine will remain a place for both people in some way, then that leads us down a different path than these kinds of conclusions. And I don't know what people's end games are sometimes with the things that they say or the things that they advocate for, especially in the diaspora. So yeah, I mean, I guess a question I have is, like, what do we do with those who don't share this premise? What do we do with this, you know, how could we even talk about co-resistance with the landscape looking like this?
So I do think that I don't think we can talk about the shrinking space for resistance that isn't armed or total collaboration for non-armed resistance or collaboration. I don't think we can talk about that shrinking space without really understanding that it didn't shrink on its own. And I hate to disagree or push back, because I love all of you tremendously, but I think that the shrinking of that space was by state design, and not only, you know, the U.S. state, not only it was,
well, Oslo, right? The Oslo framework, yeah.
But, like, for example, Naomi, you mentioned earlier, this actually segued better into it, but Naomi, you mentioned earlier that your son is really kind of obsessed with this, the NGO killer bill.
Mm-hmm.
But that bill exists in a long legacy of laws, frameworks, regulations, state decisions that shrink the space for resistance. So I was thinking very clearly of Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, which was a Supreme Court case that was decided in the United States. And I'm forgetting right now what year it was, but we'll add it in later. That was decided in the United States in the wake of 9/11. And what it decided was that, basically, with the creation of these foreign terrorist organization lists and the outlawing of all material support to them, that material support was really widely interpreted to include advice and other things. So human rights groups who had been providing support to the PKK, the Tamil Tigers, various groups engaged in liberation projects with questionable practices, but nonetheless engaged in liberation projects. And basically, they argued that the support that we provide for them is distinctly nonviolent. In fact, we do the opposite. We train these groups on how to access UN reporting, on how to file lawsuits, on how to set up conflict resolution mechanisms that are independent of the state. And we saw that that was quickly stamped out by the Supreme Court in the United States and by the state. I'm also thinking of, Turkey and Russia, and I'm thinking of how in Turkey, there is no room for Kurdish resistance that isn't armed. And that's partly because it was the criminalization of anything that could possibly lead or be connected to the PKK. And this is true from state to state to state. And so I think that the reason that we find ourselves in this place is actually because we did not center state violence as a center, as a creator of violence. And so when we look at, because I actually think if we take Zionism as a cautionary tale, which I do think it is, I think that as an Armenian, there are many Armenians who look to Zionism as something that we should emulate, and it's a really kind of frustrating, a horrifying experience, saying that isn't so. It becomes easier when Zionism's most violent manifestations show up. It becomes easier when a genocide becomes so undeniable as it is now in Gaza. But I think that's actually not the right approach. That's the wrong time to be opposed to Zionism or emulating Zionism. The right time is before the escalations and there's always mass death when it comes to Zionism, but before the escalations that we see. And it's one of the reasons that I insist, for example, on calling the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh a genocide, because to me, these things are a process, and that is absolutely a part of the process of genocide. But the reason that I push back on the idea that the shrinking space for co-resistance has to do with a lack of imagination is because I actually think that it maybe has to do with having decentered state violence at the wrong time and now reaping the consequences of empowering states to this degree. Because we do live in a world where states have a monopoly on violence, and we do live in a world where in order to engage in armed resistance, you also have to engage in collaboration with states. That's just a fact. There is no example of a group that is manufacturing its own weapons and able to resist their own mass death. And in navigating that, I actually think that we're at an impossible situation. It's going to require of us impossible choices, but there is a reality that we have to grapple with, which is that people only have space for armed resistance in many places in the world, and that armed resistance is intrinsically tied with collaboration to state violence. It might not be right in front of you, but it's somewhere else. And I think Armenians
I don't disagree, by the way.
No,
neither do I.
I know. And I just think it's important to bring up, in part also because I think Armenians are a great example of the limitations of of statehood as the end goal of a nationality project, which is something that we talk about a lot on Obscurus and are going to talk about more. But, right now we have a liberal collaborationist government in Armenia that considers our achievement of statehood as enough to protect the Armenian people. And I'm from Artsakh, my family roots are there, and it's very clear to me that is not enough. But it's also clear to me that statehood was not only not enough to protect Armenians, we didn't even weaponize it when we could have to protect Kurds or Yazidis or other people. So for me, the question really is, in a world where we are intrinsically connected to states, which means we are violent at every action, we are connected to these violent projects, and that makes our movements violent too. And I take responsibility for that because we have to. But in that world, in this framework that we're in, how can we disentangle ourselves from that violence piece by piece? And I think that's a very hard question to answer. And I also think that it often results, and I really try and always extend so much grace, because I think it results in people choosing to entangle with state violence a lot more than I would. And in part, I think it's because we haven't centered the violence of a state enough to show that is a cancer at the heart of the liberation movement.
So yeah, I mean, maybe I'm taking a little bit too much for granted in terms of what we all know, that every form of nonviolent resistance has been shut down, the anti-BDS laws, the rest of it. And as somebody who's been supporting BDS since 2008, with the publication of the shock doctrine and working with the BDS National Committee, I mean, I've been part of these debates for so long, and I know like how important invoking international, that's like, I knew that we were going to have to step up BDS organizing in that moment. And as has happened, and the BDS call is until Israel complies with international law, right? And that doesn't mean that Palestinians don't have a right to armed resistance. It does mean that they are bound by international law. And that doesn't mean that we can't understand why that is violated for unoccupied people without precision weapons, without all kinds of options. There's a difference between understanding that and celebrating it, which did happen, even though people deny that it did happen, right? And there's a distinction between people celebrating in Gaza and people celebrating, in Montreal or wherever, So it's just a lot of this gets flattened, right, into very simple binaries that I just think we should be able to. Just to be clear, I don't believe in nonviolence in all situations. I mean, I would like to live in a world like that, but that's not the world that we live in.
A couple of things, if that's okay to add. I think we honestly mostly agree anyway. I think it's some anyway. One of the things that kind of baffled me after October 7th, and this is as Naomi actually just said, I make a very, very clear distinction between how people who are on the ground are reacting to something and how people who are not, and even people who are not, if they're themselves directly connected and if they're not directly connected, there's like different shades of this. So like if you're in Gaza and you're celebrating when there were those Iranian rockets, I'm not gonna tell you don't, like that's not my place. There are basically no options left at that point, and they didn't do much for that matter, but I understand where that would come from. At least I try to. I'm not in that situation, so I do the best I can. But for those who are outside, there have been, I mentioned in the chat earlier that Mu'taz, the Palestinian journalist from Gaza, he posted just yesterday a kind of a before and after photo of Rafah. And he said, remember the hashtag all eyes on Rafah. And this is what it looks like today. It just reminds me, it's like this kind of big thing, because a lot of the energy has gone to sharing awareness raising, quote unquote. I have some issues with that. Not that it's not important. There's a place for it, but it got to the point where like it almost felt like that was most of what was being done. And one thing that kind of struck me, and this is not, there's like two examples that are interlinked, that before even October 7th, there was no real engagement in our spaces. And here I'm speaking specifically in diasporas, with, for example, the refuseniks, the Israelis who refuse to join the IDF and who go to jail for some time, then they try again, and et cetera, et cetera. And since October 7th, one thing that I find kind of the elephant in the room in many ways, and I mentioned this in my conversation with Musa Okonga on this podcast, which is that a lot of the calls for ceasefire did not intersect enough with calls for the release of the Israeli hostages. And that's kind of odd in some sense, because that's kind of the same demand. That is the same demand. It's to stop the violence and for the hostages to release, which they cannot be if the violence isn't stopped. So like the two kind of are interlinked. And instead what I found is on the streets, especially you saw, but of course online as well, from where I was, Geneva to Paris to Marseille, which are the cities I saw in that time period, to now here in the UK as well, different places, almost like a rivalry between like stop the genocide graffitis and photos of the specifically Israeli hostages, saying like, what about him? Or, a biography or something like that. And I think there's been a missed opportunity. I read just today, actually, I think on The Guardian, they were speaking to I don't remember the name. If I remember, I'll put it in the show notes. A woman who's one of the relatives, I don't want to say something wrong, but I think her relative was a hostage. I think still is. I don't know if that was one of those who were killed or not. And she became a very vocal opponent of the war. She opposes Netanyahu, and she also calls for a common future for Israelis and Palestinians. And I don't see much engagement with people like her. And I, like, just even strategically, let alone morally, like just strategically, I find that quite objectively, I cannot but conclude that it hasn't brought us anything good. Not that it's the only thing, and I'm not just to, maybe that it's me being extra nuanced over here. I know folks probably know this by now. It's not to say that this is the main thing that matters. It's more like this is something that at least was under our control, that we could at least influence. And it does seem like logically that it could have led to something, rather than this becoming very, very like black and white. I don't like that term. Like very like you either support the end of the genocide or you care about the Israeli hostages, and that creates even discursively a weird position, a weird place to be on, because you're not actually debating the thing that you should be debating. You're not actually discussing the things that you would want to have discussing. How do we end this right now? What are the steps to end this right now? And how do we just prioritize this first and foremost, and then figure out the things as like step two? And that's sort of where I was at the time, and honestly still am.
Well, it reminds me of some of what I wrote about in Doppelganger around, this line about once something an issue gets touched by them, it becomes untouchable by us, right? And so in the context of the pandemic, we saw this around questions raised around lockdown and school closures and, even vaccine verification apps. And it's like, once this is an issue on the sort of conspiratorial right, then we just take the opposite position. And I think there's no doubt that all those hostage posters were part of a Hasbara operation. They were coming from a place of justifying the genocide. It was a weaponization of grief and loss. And the impulse is to just be like, okay, that's their issue. It's sort of tainted and, it's inherently reactionary when, as you say, there was no reason why it couldn't be a call for a ceasefire and hostage release. And I think lots of people did do that. But I do know that after the family members get paraded at the Republican National Convention this goes back to like the original debates about October 7th. Like Gabriel Wynant wrote this piece basically saying it's impossible for Israeli lives to be grieved in public because they are pre-grieved and their lives are already being turned. Those lost lives are already being turned into bullets. And then other people making the point, including me, but lots of other people, that if we cede this territory, that's the ultimate gift to those who are weaponizing that grief, because then anybody who is feeling any grief has nowhere to go because they're getting a cold shoulder from the left saying you're not allowed to grieve, but emotions are unruly and people are going to grieve, and then I think it pushed some people maybe to the right who might not have.
The link to Syria for me is one of those things that for me it's kind of maybe going broader slightly. I'm not entirely sure. But there is something weirdly hopeful about the past. I mean, other than the obvious obvious for our listeners, I guess, that the fact that the Assad regime collapsed, which those in our world never really anticipated this, at least not this fast, is that we're pretty bad at predicting the future as humans in general. When it comes to humans, I mean, we can say, oh, the star is going to show up at whatever because of our calculations and shit. But in terms of just like where is politics going to look like next year? Or whatever, we can have some kind of educated guesses, but ultimately we're projecting from what we know today. And a single thing can change, and that just makes it utterly irrelevant. To name maybe the obvious, Trump is pretty old and not in good health. So like that might already change things maybe for the worse, because his second dude is not exactly good. But it's one of those things that for me, to also go back to your point of not ceding that ground, is that when Netanyahu talks, he speaks like he's, I'm sorry, I do film studies, so apologies for that, but he speaks like he's Thanos, in Avengers, like I am inevitable. He speaks like he is history with a capital H. He speaks like, we are changing the Middle East. He said this a few days ago. We said we're going to change the Middle East, and that's what we started doing. And a lot of people take that specifically, because he said it in the context of the Assad regime collapsing. And a lot of people take that and then conclude what he wants you to conclude, which is that, well, they have a hand in all of this. They are that omnipresent. They are that powerful They, although they had zero and they had nothing to do with the Assad regime collapsing in Syria itself, they can come indirectly claim it, or not really, but like they can kind of imply, and then the conspiracy, the baking that happens online does it on its own. But like, what if he's just wrong? Like, what if he thinks that something is gonna get there, but it won't because of A, B, and C? And to name the elephant in the room here is that virtually no one, I mean, I did joke earlier this year that I predict the Assad regime would collapse, but I did not know that this was going to happen, and now I can claim credit, but I was just guessing, and I was just, whatever, I was hoping. But it took, that dynasty, that regime lasted 54 years, and it collapsed in 10 days. And like, it did, the day before that happened, there were already the battles. Let's say a week before that happened, not a single Syrian I know had a single doubt that they were never going back to Syria. That's never going to happen. They had shelved that idea. If maybe they had someone who's forcibly disappeared or something, they were thinking of them very concretely. But the notion that they would go back it didn't cross their minds unless they were forced to, basically.
And now they're in Damascus.
Yeah, and now they're in Damascus, and I have friends who are planning to go to Aleppo like in a month or whatever, and it's suddenly, and we have friends, including well, I'll let her reveal her real name, but Leila is her pseudonym, it's known, who's more comfortable speaking in her real name, and other folks in similar fashion. And that just changed in 10 days. And my thought has been like, I think a lot of that Milton Friedman quote, which I don't even remember, but it's a paraphrase of like, in the ideas lying around. I mean, you've probably quoted it yourself, Naomi. Ideas, yeah.
Hey, I made that one famous in the shock doctrine.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Our job is to make the politically impossible, politically inevitable, to have the ideas ready when, yeah. Okay. I don't even, I used to quote it like every day.
So there's like a genuine lesson there. There's a genuine lesson there, because I am among those. I used to be very, very active on Syria until roughly 2018. I was very active between roughly 2014 and 2018. 2016, the fall of Aleppo, and then more big cities fell after that, some before that. But Aleppo was kind of the big symbolic one for Syrians and those of us who are allied with them and stuff. But history didn't stop in 2018. It just didn't. And there's something for me that's actually kind of hopeful, in the sense that like I was just reminded in the moment that me personally giving up on Syria, it's not even fair to myself to say this, but like I was exhausted and I didn't know what to do, and many people around me were as well, but made no difference on the ground. They didn't give two shits about the fact that I personally stopped, and that's a good thing. That's something that's actually hopeful for me.
That's the thing, is that like we know what state policies do, but I am kind of unwilling, and that's where my questions came from, and that's what I was centering in this discussion, is like I'm kind of unwilling to cede that we have agency in all of this, that we can pursue different paths and come up with other ideas that we can seize upon in critical junctures.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just building on the Friedman idea of needing to have the ideas lying around until such a point as the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable, right? Is like, we can't predict what the shock will be, right? But we can prepare. And I do think that these discussions around guiding principles, values, what we actually stand for, right? Like really making the worldview visible and not implicit, right? But actually being clear about it. That's part of it. So, it's not just like the ideas lying around are not just like privatize the water, like that's like a Friedmanite idea, But one of the things that I think was really damaging after October 7th was that people were trying to figure out what their worldview was in the teeth of a crisis, right? They were putting out terrible statements, then rescinding them, taking them back, because they had not figured out the basics within their organization, right? What is their position on targeting civilians, right? Are there civilians in Israel? Like, that would be a good thing to figure out, not in a state of crisis or emergency, but to actually have them figured out ahead of time. And so I think we're in a rolling crisis now. We're in a staccato crisis. And so we're not going to have the luxury of figuring this stuff out outside of crisis. But there are lulls, and there are, or else we just have to figure it out on the fly, and be ready for the next shock. Because it is an impossibility really to figure it out in the teeth of crisis, which is why we're all so vulnerable to people who say, I have it figured out. Here's what we believe, right?
I mean, that going back to the division of labor, poli-sci literature talks about moderate versus radical flanks. But for me, I think of it this kind of division of labor in terms of our positionalities. We can't expect right now Palestinians under the brunt of Israeli state violence to necessarily be able to articulate some of these values, or come up with other ideas beyond survival right now, right? Given the scope of everything. But maybe that's where we have the responsibility to have these discussions, and speak candidly amongst ourselves. And yes, we are in a crisis too. And some of us, in various levels of our lives, so I'm an academic, and so that's in crisis mode.
Yeah.
Not in the same level, of course, but we still, maybe like that's the division of labor we need to think about. Like who right now has to triage and survive, and who can think about some of these things moving forward.
And this is why I think it really does matter to reread the BDS call, because that was a remarkable collaboration from Palestinian civil society. As far as my understanding, the broadest coalition ever of Palestinian civil society coming together for an agreed upon call. And the call is for the application of international humanitarian law. And so it is, in the teeth of a genocide, it is impossible, but there are some agreements that can be held, right? That predate an acceleration of crisis.
I was just gonna add that one of my concerns now is that when there is gonna be a ceasefire, because there will be at some point, not only will the news coverage die, which is already largely died down compared to even a few months ago, but a lot of the people who were active on Palestine will be less so. And that is it's a different sort of crisis, although very interlinked, because it kind of says that ultimately activism is in reaction to something rather than as part, which is part of it anyway. It's inevitable, but the part of the difficulty is also how do we also get into the business of creating something, setting the standards, or trying to set the standards. If we are unsuccessful, we can try, and that's ultimately we're reacting to what the Israelis are doing to Palestinians, which we have to when they're doing a genocide. But if they stop one day, because everything does stop one day, what happens next? I saw the horrible, I think it was in The Guardian, of a vast majority of Palestinian children just expect death. And some 50% or so have suicidal ideations and all of that stuff. They're there. Those who have not been murdered will be there. What do we do with them? How do we talk to them? How do we help them? All of that stuff is difficult. I do not have the answer, obviously. But it's not as likely to be something you take to the streets on a weekly basis and have signs that says what about their mental health, or what about this, or what about that. It doesn't translate the same way, because it's not an immediate action. Although I know, I hope you see what I mean. It's one of those things that I'm concerned because the work that has to be done, and I am specifically talking about mental health for children, although obviously it's absolutely part of this wider thing, but most Palestinians in Gaza are underage. Before talking about the wider narratives, the wider cause, all of that, because that's part and parcel. How can we have the cause if the children are suffering from PTSD for the next 2, 3, 4 generations? What will the cause be? I mean, either we're just speaking for them and imagining what this cause looks like. Concretely, this is going to be one of the more urgent things to do as soon as the ceasefire happens. Anyway, that's just one example among many, but it's just one of those that concerns me for sure, because I've already seen the second Syria was in the news, Palestine was less so. And there's this attention economy, there's this, of course, fatigue that all humans have. All of those are jumbled up together. It's not one or the other necessarily. And then my mind goes in very different directions. How do we do in terms of structural issues related to the media and our shorter attention spans, and what counts as activism online, and is it clicktivism only, and et cetera, et cetera. And a part of this project is to kind of put them all out there rather than being necessarily prescriptive. I never know how to pronounce that word. But it is part of that problem. And for me, I'll end on this note, like Palestine has been turned into a metaphor. There's even a book like Palestine as Metaphor, of course, and there is a room for that. And especially if you're, a poet or whatnot, there's that. And there's a usefulness to metaphors because they're effectively stories, and you can connect to other stories elsewhere with that, even if you come from different backgrounds. So it's not like useless. But my worry with Palestine, I say this as someone whose grandfather was born in Haifa and had passed away like 4 years ago now, never been able to go back, is if it has been turned mostly into a metaphor in a lot of the discourses, a lot of the spaces, especially in the West, in the Arab world, maybe to a different degree because there's a different genealogy there, and whether that's good, whether it's something to be challenged or to be thought about or whatever, because I worry that we think a lot, and I do come from a Syria perspective or Syria-centric perspective here, because Syria is one of those places where basically the entire population and their entire lives, their entire history, as far as many people in the Palestine space in the West are concerned, could just be sacrificed, could just be like, it's a stepping stone. It's literally in between where the weapons to Hezbollah can go, and it becomes geopolitical, it becomes abstract, it becomes whatever, and it doesn't address real people who are living real lives and suffering under, for the most part, unprecedented types of oppression. And there is a lot of tension there that some people are better than I am at navigating all of this, but it is there. It's difficult to ignore it.
I think you bring up a good point of how we have begun to act as though we've become responsive. But I do think that the reason that campus and status politics on the left are so strong is because they're not responsive. There are infrastructures that are set up that actually to me mirror a lot of what I saw on, or what we have seen and been able to trace on in the American conservative movement. A movement that was very successful at being able to set up the ideas that are ready for the moment to come. We're living in the moment we're living at that moment right now, that the ideas that have always been there for everyone to see have finally, their time has come, and now we are living in the consequences of that. But I also think that, like, in keeping sort of with the theme of the project and the podcast, is that some of those answers lie not with us here, but in the peripheries. Because the truth is that no matter what we say or do, Palestinian children are going to keep being born today, tomorrow, and in 5 years and in 10 years. And their parents are going to take care of their mental health, and their parents are going to tell them stories and sing to them and find ways to build that resilience for them. And I think that actually, to be honest, something that I'm constantly struck with is the ability in Palestinian society specifically, and in the diaspora too, but to build these caretaking structures across, very real obstacles, checkpoints, prison walls, surveillance. All of these things are real obstacles, and we actually see the ways that in which Palestinians build against them. And as an Armenian, I also see kind of the opposite, which was in many ways a community that chose to hang our hat on statehood, that chose to hang our hat on the idea that preserving statehood is enough to protect us and to move forward. And it very clearly wasn't. And actually, something that people often say, and I get into this argument with Armenians all the time, is they say, well, we're in a better position than the Palestinians. We have a country. And I deeply disagree. I disagree I disagree strongly, because I see that while we have a country, we also have a perfect map of how that country and how these people will cease to exist, and how the people that state project is ostensibly supposed to protect are removed from their land, and in many cases almost permanently, and even personally feel a disconnect from that land. So all this to say that I think that it may not be our job to figure out what how to comfort Palestinian children, because the truth is, like, we just can't. Like, they're like, I can't pick up a child that's not my own and ever give him the comfort that his mother or grandmother or even his neighbor could. But what I can do, and what I think it really is our job to do, is to see these structures that have formed and ask ourselves how we can replicate them. There are many different forms of both resistance and caretaking that have been created under these circumstances of oppression. And I think a better question is to find a way to genuinely tie them to each other in a world that actively seeks to disaggregate them. And I think part of that also has to be rejecting the philosophies and the impulses that seek to separate these issues. And, you know, as somebody who's studied law is a big part of that. Law exists to disaggregate indigenous rights from a national struggle. These two things are one and the same, but under international law, they're treated as two different struggles, which is fascinating and super weird. It's super weird to anyone who's ever like been involved in any kind of indigenous movement, because you're like, this is the same thing. And yet under international law, they're often treated as different movements, different groups, different rights even. And so I think we really have to identify where these obstacles and where these barriers are coming up and how we can get around them. And sometimes the answer is we can't, but you at least have to know where they are.
Or we can't right now, you know.
We can't right now, yeah.
You know, coming full circle to where we started, and you know, what I see a lot of what your project doing around having clear politics and principles beyond campism. You know, one of the areas where I see this playing out is around freedom of speech, where it's like, you know, it is not clear a lot of times whether the left believes in freedom of speech. We don't like it when people try to censor us, but we get pretty casual about censoring other people. And I, with the ferocity of the crackdowns on speech about Palestine, I don't see how we can fight back without really just beating the people who are for freedom of speech, including speech we disagree with, obviously with some limits. But I'm just worried that I'm seeing examples of the anti-normalization discourse pushing us very far in the opposite direction, and I'm just worried about what that is going to mean in our ability to fight back against these ferocious attacks on speech from states when we look like hypocrites a lot of the time.
It's a thing. Yeah, no.
No, I was just going to say, I do think that something that I've learned from is that, well, Naomi, when reading your book, I was sort of like screaming and like jumping up and down when you started talking about the mirror world, because literally, I was literally doing that. But it was because for me, it was something that, and we talked about this before we recorded a little bit, but I think for a lot of us, we'd been living in the mirror world or looking at the mirror world for a long, long time. And it predates COVID. It predated, you know, the particular turn of conservative politics in the US, because the mirror world is the same thing that Palestinians and also Armenians mean when they say every accusation is a confession. And you're living in this maddening universe, this just completely maddening universe where you talk about something that is real, that is a real part of your history, and you're met with something that sounds real and it feels real. And it's like in My Cousin Vinny, where he says it's like a brick. You're looking at it and it has rectangular sides and straight sides. And no matter what you do, it is actually so hard to turn that brick and show that it's actually a piece of paper. And I think about this in the context of Armenia and Azerbaijan all the time, because, you know, a big part of the Azerbaijani project was rewriting the history. It was rewriting the entire, you know, topographical, real history of this place. And so for us, we've sort of been living in this funhouse mirror universe. But what that also means is I think I'm able to see ways in which actually the Palestinian discourse has been very successful at changing a lot of minds in a way that I think Armenian discourse hasn't been, even for people who like us. And that I think is really worth looking at. But the reason, and I'm almost sort of grateful a lot to many Palestinian activists for putting free speech back in the place where it should be in the left's arsenal in a lot of ways, because one of the things that was really interesting to be talking about free speech before this was that there were people saying, like, talking about the Palestine exception to free speech, and somehow, for some reason, we felt like we were trapped in the funhouse mirror, where you were looking at the groups talking about free speech, and it felt like you were like, well, this is the most obvious, big, like, state enforced belief system that, you know, you literally have to sign your name to in many occasions, and you're looking at, like, and yet it's accepted from the free speech discourse. And so I feel like, in, like, again, in this area of, like, bringing the periphery to the center, of understanding that the periphery is the center, of almost feeling like, in many ways, like, the American left, liberals, whoever it was, ignored ignored sort of the screaming periphery showing them of where this was going to be headed. And of course, that's where it ended up being. So yeah, back to the mirror world we went.
The interesting thing, I was on the It Could Happen Here podcast years ago now, and I mentioned in that interview that for me, as someone who's from Lebanon, who already has seen a number of apocalypses, effectively, it has already happened. And it's not that there aren't lessons to be learned both sides, essentially, but it is, and I mean, they do this quite well, like their experience of what they've learned from other contexts, they're trying to use that to basically tell Americans, it is a US-centric focus, at the very least, podcast, like, take these other contexts seriously, because there's nothing about us that's special. And that's one of the... it's a very difficult thing to decenter oneself and even, like, one's imagined community and nation and whatever. But again, to go back to Syria, for me, Syria has been a very, very revealing reality, because especially in the context of our region, because it's also very tied, obviously, to Palestine and to Lebanon. To Lebanon as the Syrian regime as a previously military occupier, but also and because of the wave of Syrian refugees, as the place that they were being oppressed, Syrians in this case. And to Palestine, that Palestine has also been in many ways relocated, not that it's not still in Palestine, but because there are Palestinian Syrians, Yarmouk was called Little Palestine, the Palestinian refugee camp outside of Damascus. And that they were able in many ways to not just recreate, or at the very least pass on, the traditions and stories and cultures of their parents and grandparents, but to use that to make a direct link after 2011, the uprising in the Arab Spring and so on, with the other Syrians, because it's complicated how Palestinian Syrians view themselves. Some do see themselves as Syrians as well, some don't. It's not the place for it now. But to connect with other Syrians, or with Syrians, in the uprising against the Assad regime, and to use their Palestinianness in that, because the Assad regime instrumentalized and co-opted the Palestinian cause in the context of Syria. And now today, after the downfall of the Assad regime, it's been a couple of weeks or so now, at protests, it's not even protests, at celebrations in Syria, most of the flags flown, like in Aleppo, Damascus, and so on, is obviously the new Syrian flag, which technically is the old Syrian flag, but also the Palestinian flag. And no, it's unprompted. And that's something that's very different compared to before. No one's forcing them to do so. There's no There's no Assad regime, obviously. But it is something that they see as, like, I'll end on this note, and maybe I'm in the awkward position of wrapping up, which is it's not easy, but there's a number of different signs and people who were, like, on the streets in Damascus and so on. Like, one of them that I really loved is, "O Gaza," I'm translating, like, "O Gaza, we haven't forgotten you in our day of happiness, in our day of joy, we haven't forgotten you," basically. And there's something there that I do genuinely find, other than, like, moving and very powerful, but, like, useful, in the sense that I want to try and understand how, in such a context, in still mid-celebration of the collapse of a dynasty that has ruled over you and your parents and your grandparents for 5 decades, you still have mental space to think about Gaza. And because, again, it's unprompted and you get nothing out of this. It makes zero quote-unquote difference in the kind of geopolitical or whatever sense. But it's still there. And that's, for me, something that's, like, at least worth building upon then. Yeah, thanks, Naomi. Thanks a lot for coming on. Dana and Anna, thanks for co-hosting this. Listeners, thanks you for listening for I don't know how long now.
Thanks for having me. I really loved
Absolutely.
meeting all of you and really appreciate your work. Yeah.
Here.